think it's a mistake to think that just because your phones are ringing, you assume that everything is working efficiently and optimally. Instead, ask yourself if you know these three things. First, do you know how well each of your marketing initiatives is driving calls from sales and fixed ops leads? Do you know how well your departments or BDCs are answering those phone calls? And third, do you know how well those calls are actually converting to phone leads? So how well are those departments and BDCs who are answering those calls converting those leads to sales and fixed ops appointments? If you don't know all three of these things, there's a good chance that there is some inefficiencies that, if you correct, can drive a huge improvement to your marketing results. Let me show you really quickly what I mean. So again, if you're not actively managing or optimizing for phone leads today, which means that you're not looking at data and making decisions based on that data to drive improvements and eliminate issues, then you're probably going to have a series of challenges. We looked at a study of dealerships who were not doing this today, and we found that the first problem marketers are going to face is inefficient search and digital advertising. So if you're not optimizing for phone leads and you're just optimizing for web forms and the calls are just a byproduct of your ads, then a good chance a lot of those calls that you're getting are not leads. We've seen that up to 70% of ad-driven calls aren't phone leads if you're not taking optimization steps. Number two, you're probably having a lot of calls at your dealerships going unanswered. So we saw that 35% of calls to dealers never actually speak to a human being. They might hang up, they might leave a voicemail, they might interact with an IVR, but they don't actually talk to a person in order to go ahead and get help and book an appointment. And lastly, there's an inefficiency in terms of converting phone leads to actual appointments. So for sales, 80% of sales calls aren't converted on that call to a test drive. And for service calls, 65% of them are not converted to a repair or a service appointment. So you can see there's a lot of issues and inefficiencies here with the amount of phone leads that are being driven from paid advertising, how well the dealerships and BDCs are answering and converting those phone calls. So it is a big problem, but the good news is that it is fixable. And if you fix it, huge results can be driven from just a small improvement to those three lead metrics. And let me show you what I mean. So here are the averages that we just discussed in terms of phone leads for answered calls, percentage that are leads, and booked test appointments on the call. So let's look at a paid advertising campaign that drove 1,000 calls. Okay, so you paid for 1,000 calls from a digital advertising campaign. Based on the numbers we just showed you on the last slide, only 650 of those calls were answered. Of those 650, 30% were sales leads. So that means 140 sales leads were driven. And based on the conversion rate of sales calls, only 28% of those booked an actual test drive on the call. Now, based on industry averages, you've got booked test drive appointments. Maybe of those 28, 17 will show up and complete a test drive at your dealership. From those 17, 12 will go on to actually buy a vehicle. And based on the average profit most dealers make per vehicle in the US, that comes out to about $48,000 rather of profit driven from the sale of those vehicles. Now your numbers might vary a little bit, but these are averages, industry averages. Now let's look at what happens if we improve those three phone lead metrics by just 5 percentage points. We're not talking about doubling the improvement. We're talking about simply improving each of them just a little bit. So if the dealerships answer 70% of the calls versus 65, all of a sudden now we've got 700 calls answered from those 1,000 that you're driving from your digital campaign. 35% of those are now sales leads because you're optimizing better. That means all of a sudden from those 700, you've got 245 sales leads versus 140. Your sales team is doing a better job of converting those calls. So now all of a sudden you've got 61 converted on the call to a test drive. Again, small improvements, lead to a big difference. And if everything else stays the same, you're going to end up selling 26 cars with a profit per vehicle of 104,000 K. So just by improving, these 3 phone lead metrics by a small amount, it has a compound effect, and you can almost more than double your profitability and your revenue from the phone calls you're driving from your digital ads.